When you hear Great Depression, you probably picture Wall Street in chaos, right? Dusty bread lines in America. But what about Europe? A continent just barely back on its feet after one war and about to be thrown headfirst into another. Well, the story of Europe's Great Depression isn't just about money. It's about a series of dominoes, a chain of choices that would ultimately decide the fate of democracy itself. Seriously, just when you hear Great Depression, you probably picture Wall Street in chaos, right? Dusty bread lines in America. But what about Europe? A continent just barely back on its feet after one war and about to be thrown headfirst into another. Well, the story of Europe's Great Depression isn't just about money. It's about a series of dominoes, a chain of choices that would ultimately decide the fate of democracy itself.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. In 1931, that absolute nightmare became a terrifying reality for millions of people across Europe. And it all started with a single bank failure in Austria, the very first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would bring an entire continent to its knees.
And the choices that would ultimately decide the fate of democracy itself.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. In 1931, that absolute nightmare became a terrifying reality for millions of people across Europe. And it all started with a single bank failure in Austria, the very first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would bring an entire continent to its knees.
And the scale of this thing, it's hard to even wrap your head around. In just a few years, international trade in Europe just collapsed by a staggering 2/3. Factories went dark, 1 in every 5 workers lost their job. So how on earth did Europe spiral from this fragile recovery into total and complete financial ruin?
To really get what happened, we've got to look at the ground everything was built on. And let me tell you, it was shaky. Post-World War I Europe was a continent of rubble and debt, just desperately trying to put the pieces back together.
And this slide, this right here, shows you Europe's Achilles heel, the productivity gap. While American industry was absolutely booming, Europe was lagging way, way behind, still rebuilding. And that meant Europe was deeply and, as it turns out, dangerously dependent on American money. We're talking billions in loans, just to keep the lights on.
And hanging over every single decision, every conversation, was the ghost of hyperinflation. This quote, it comes from the pure trauma of the early 1920s in Germany, where money lost its value so fast that people literally papered their walls with it. That memory created this desperate, all-consuming need for one thing: stability.
And for them, stability had a name: the gold standard. The logic was pretty simple, right? You can't just print more gold. So tying your currency to this finite resource was seen as the ultimate guarantee against your money becoming worthless. It was like the holy grail of financial trust.
But yeah, that stability, it came at a huge cost. Sticking to the gold standard meant playing by these really rigid, painful rules. It basically forced governments into austerity, so they had to slash spending and jack up interest rates during a downturn, which is the exact opposite of what you do today to fight a recession. It put their economies in what were basically golden handcuffs.
And boy, were those handcuffs about to get tight. Because in October 1929, Wall Street crashed. You've heard the saying, right? When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Well, in this case, it was more like double pneumonia.
Okay, so look at this. This slide shows the delicate cycle that was holding Europe together. You had American money flowing to Germany. Germany used that money to pay war reparations to France and Britain, and then France and Britain used that money to pay their war debts back to America. It was this global merry-go-round, all powered by U.S. credit. The 1929 crash didn't just slow it down, it shattered the whole thing.
And just like that, poof, the American lifeline was gone. Panicked U.S. banks stopped all new lending and started demanding their old loans be paid back immediately. The global ATM was officially closed, and the bill was due.
So, with the financial system totally seizing up, nations did what anyone does in a panic. They looked out for number one. The era of global cooperation, over. The era of economic warfare had just begun.
And what came next was this just disastrous chain reaction of protectionism. America fired the first shot with massive tariffs. Europe immediately fired back. France, Germany, even Great Britain, the historic champion of free trade for nearly a century, threw up massive walls. The world just shut down into these hostile economic blocks, and it strangled trade for everyone.
And just when you thought it couldn't possibly get any worse, the crisis moved from the factories and the shipping docks right into the banks. This is when the panic stopped being a headline and started being something that terrified ordinary people.
I mean, just look at how fast this financial firestorm spread in the summer of 1931. It starts in May in Austria.
Then bam, it jumps to Germany in July, then Hungary. With every single failure, the panic just grew and grew. Because if these massive, too-big-to-fail institutions could collapse, was anyone's money safe?
And the answer, as you can probably guess, was a resounding no. What you got was the classic bank run, a total self-fulfilling prophecy of collapse, as terrified citizens literally stormed the banks, demanding cash that the banks simply did not have.
So all of this, every bit of it, brought Europe to this one single, terrifying crossroads. Every nation faced the exact same fateful choice, and the decision they made would have consequences that would echo for decades.
And this was the impossible dilemma. I mean, both options were terrible. Option 1, you stick with the gold standard. The pro is you get currency stability. But the con, you are forced into brutal austerity, slashing spending, crushing wages, all in the middle of a depression. Option 2, abandon gold. This gives you the freedom to print money and cut interest rates to try and kickstart the economy. But the risk? Runaway inflation. That wallpaper money that everyone was so terrified of.
And this is the whole point. This is why this story is so critical. The path each country chose didn't just shape their economy. It literally determined their political future. It was, in many ways, a choice between democracy and dictatorship.
I mean, this table just says it all, doesn't it? Germany chose to defend gold at all costs and embrace this crippling austerity. And the result? The total collapse of their democracy and the rise of the Nazi Party. Britain, on the other hand, made the incredibly painful choice to abandon gold, and while they suffered terribly, their democracy, it survived.
So, if you want to understand why Germany's democracy shattered, a big part of the answer is this number right here. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. That's nearly a third of the entire workforce. This was the crushing human cost of sticking to the gold standard.
The man who had to enforce this policy was Chancellor Brüning. They had a nickname for him, the Hunger Chancellor. His brutal austerity policies didn't save the economy, they strangled it. And in doing so, they created this massive tidal wave of misery and desperation that pushed people toward political extremes.
And if you look at the raw data, the charts tell the exact same story. You see Germany's industrial output just falling off a cliff, a drop of 40%. Britain, on the other hand, after abandoning gold, it stabilized and began a slow, very painful recovery. Two choices, two completely different outcomes.
Now look, this doesn't mean everything was rosy in Britain. Not at all. We had events like the Jarrow March, where hundreds of unemployed men marched 300 miles to London. It became this huge symbol of national despair. But the key difference was this. Britain's democratic institutions, while they were strained to their absolute limits, ultimately bent without breaking. Which leaves us with this final, really tough question. The story of Europe's Great Depression isn't just history. It's this stark, timeless reminder of the incredibly fragile link between economic policy and political freedom. And it forces us to ask ourselves, how much economic pain can any democracy withstand before its people start looking for a different answer?